The Ionian Revolt, and associated revolts in Aeolis, Doris, Cyprus and Caria, were military rebellions by several Greek regions of Asia Minor against Persian rule, lasting from 499 BC to 493 BC. At the heart of the rebellion was the dissatisfaction of the Greek cities of Asia Minor with the tyrants appointed by Persia to rule them, along with the individual actions of two Milesian tyrants, Histiaeus and Aristagoras. The cities of Ionia had been conquered by Persia around 540 BC, and thereafter were ruled by native tyrants, nominated by the Persian satrap in Sardis. In 499 BC, the then tyrant of Miletus, Aristagoras, launched a joint expedition with the Persian satrap Artaphernes to conquer Naxos, in an attempt to bolster his position. The mission was a debacle, and sensing his imminent removal as tyrant, Aristagoras chose to incite the whole of Ionia into rebellion against the Persian king Darius the Great. In 498 BC, supported by troops from Athens and Eritrea, the Ionians marched on, captured, and burnt Sardis. However, on the return journey to Ionia, they were followed by Persian troops, and decisively beaten at the Battle of Ephesus. This campaign was the only offensive action by the Ionians, who subsequently went on the defensive. The Persians responded in 497 BC with a three-pronged attack aimed at recapturing the outlying areas of the rebellion. But the spread of the revolt at Caria meant that the largest army, under Doris, relocated there. While initially campaigning successfully in Caria, this army was annihilated in an ambush at the Battle of Pedssis. This resulted in a stalemate for the rest of 496 BC. In 495 BC, by 494 BC the Persian army and navy had regrouped, and they made straight for the epicenter of the rebellion at Miletus. The Ionian fleet sought to defend Miletus by sea, but were decisively beaten at the Battle of Lebe after the defection of the Samians. Miletus was then besieged, captured, and its population was brought under Persian rule. This double defeat effectively ended the revolt, and the Carians surrendered to the Persians as a result. The Persians spent 493 BC reducing the cities along the west coast that still held out against them, before finally imposing a peace settlement on Ionia which was generally considered to be both just and fair. The Ionian Revolt constituted the first major conflict between Greece and the Persian Empire, and as such represents the first phase of the Greco-Persian Wars. Although Asia Minor had been brought back into the Persian fold, Darius vowed to punish Athens and Eritrea for the support of the revolt. Moreover, seeing that the myriad city-states of Greece posed a continued threat to the stability of his empire, according to Herodotus, Darius decided to conquer the whole of Greece. In 492 BC, the first Persian invasion of Greece, the next phase of the Greco-Persian Wars, would begin as a direct consequence of the Ionian Revolt. Background: in the Dark Age that followed the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, significant numbers of Greeks emigrated to Asia Minor and settled there. These settlers were from three tribal groups: the Aeolians, Dorians and Ionians. The Ionians had settled along the coasts of Lydia and Caria, founding the 12 cities which made up Ionia. These cities were Miletus, Myus and Priene in Caria, Ephesus, Colophon, Lebedos, Teos, Clazomene, Phasia and Erythrae in Lydia, and the islands of Samos and Chios. Although the Ionian cities were independent from each other, they acknowledged the shared heritage, and had a common temple and meeting place. The Panionian They thus formed a cultural league to which they would admit no other cities, or even other tribal Ionians. The cities of Ionia had remained independent until they were conquered by the famous Lydian king Croesus in around 560 BC. The Ionian cities then remained under Lydian rule until Lydia was in turn conquered by the Naxos Empire of Cyrus the Great. While fighting the Lydians, Cyrus had sent messages to the Ionians asking them to revolt against Lydian rule, which the Ionians had refused to do. After Cyrus completed the conquest of Lydia, the Ionian cities now offered to be his subjects under the same terms as they had been subjects of Croesus. Cyrus refused, citing the Ionians' unwillingness to help him previously. The Ionians thus prepared to defend themselves, and Cyrus sent the Median general Harpagus to conquer Ionia. He first attacked Phaeacia. The Phaeacians decided to entirely abandon the city and sail into exile in Sicily, rather than become Persian subjects. Some Tyrants also chose to emigrate when Harpagus attacked Aeolis, but the rest of the Ionians remained, and were in turn conquered. The Persians found the Ionians difficult to rule. Elsewhere in the empire, Cyrus was able to identify elite native groups to help him rule his new subjects, such as the priesthood of Judea. No such group existed in Greek cities at this time. While there was usually an aristocracy, this was inevitably divided into feuding factions. The Persians thus settled for sponsoring a tyrant in each Ionian city, even though this drew them into the Ionians' internal conflicts. Furthermore, a tyrant might develop an independent stake, and have to be replaced. The tyrants themselves faced a difficult task. They had to deflect the worst of the fellow citizens' hatred, while staying in the favor of the Persians. About 40 years after the Persian conquest of Ionia, and in the reign of the fourth Persian king, Darius the Great, the stand-in Milesian tyrant Aristagoras found himself in this familiar predicament. Aristagoras's uncle Histiaeus had accompanied Darius on campaign in 513 BC, and when offered a reward, had asked for part of the conquered Thracian territory. Although this was granted, Histiaeus's ambition alarmed Darius's advisors, and Histiaeus was thus further rewarded by being compelled to remain in Susa as Darius's royal table companion. Taking over from Histiaeus, Aristagoras was faced with bubbling discontent in Miletus. In 500 BC, Aristagoras was approached by some exiles from Naxos, who asked him to take control of the island. Seeing an opportunity to strengthen his position in Miletus by conquering Naxos, Aristagoras approached the satrap of Lydia, Artaphernes, with a proposal. If Artaphernes provided an army, Aristagoras would conquer the island, thus extending the boundaries of the empire for Darius, and he would then give Artaphernes a share of the spoils to cover the cost of raising the army. Artaphernes agreed in principle and asked Darius for permission to launch the expedition. Darius assented to this, and a force of 200 triremes was assembled in order to attack Naxos the following year. Naxos Campaign. In the spring of 499 BC, Artaphernes readied the Persian force, and placed his cousin Megabates in command. He then sent ships on to Miletus, where the Ionian troops levied by Aristagoras embarked, and the force then set sail for Naxos. The expedition quickly descended into a debacle. Aristagoras fell out with Megabates on the journey towards Naxos, and Herodotus says that Megabates then sent messengers to Naxos, warning the Naxians of the forces' intention. It is also possible, however, that this story was spread by Aristagoras after the event, by way of a justification for the subsequent failure of the campaign. At any rate, the Naxians were able to prepare properly for a siege, and the Persians arrived to a well-defended expedition. The Persians laid siege to the Naxians for 4 months, but eventually they and Aristagoras both ran out of money. The force therefore sailed despondently back to the mainland. Start of the Ionian Revolt. With the failure of his attempt to conquer Naxos, Aristagoras found himself in dire straits. He was unable to repay Artaphernes, and had, moreover, alienated himself from the Persian royal family. He fully expected to be stripped of his position by Artaphernes. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Aristagoras chose to incite his own subjects, the Milesians, to revolt against the Persian masters, thereby beginning the Ionian Revolt. In autumn 499 BC, Aristagoras held a meeting with the members of his faction in Miletus. He declared that in his opinion the Milesians should revolt, to which all but the historian Histiaeus agreed. At the same time, a messenger sent by Histiaeus arrived in Miletus, imploring Aristagoras to rebel against Darius. Herodotus suggests that this was because Histiaeus was desperate to return to Ionia, and thought he would be sent to Ionia if there was a rebellion. Aristagoras therefore openly declared his revolt against Darius, abdicated from his role as tyrant, and declared Miletus to be a democracy. Herodotus has no doubt that this was only a pretense on Aristagoras's part of giving up power. Rather, it was designed to make the Milesians enthusiastically join the rebellion. The army that had been sent to Naxos was still assembled at Mysia and included contingents from other Greek cities of Asia Minor as well as men from Mytilene, Mylace, Termera and Syme. Aristagoras sent men to capture all the Greek tyrants present in the army and handed them over to the respective cities in order to gain the cooperation of those cities. Some of the tyrants were executed by the cities, but most were simply banished. It has also been suggested that Aristagoras incited the whole army to join his revolt, and also took possession of the ships that the Persians had supplied. If the latter is true, it may explain the length of time it took for the Persians to launch a naval assault on Ionia, since they would have needed to build a new fleet. Although Herodotus presents the revolt as a consequence of Aristagoras and Histiaeus's personal motives, it is clear that Ionia must have been ripe for rebellion anyway. The primary grievance was the tyrants installed by the Persians. While Greek states had in the past often been ruled by tyrants, this was a form of government on the decline. Moreover, past tyrants had tended to be strong and able leaders, whereas the rulers appointed by the Persians were simply the representatives of the Persians. Backed by Persian military might, these tyrants did not need the support of the population, and could thus rule absolutely. Aristagoras's actions have thus been likened to tossing a flame into a kindling box. They incited rebellion across Ionia, and tyrannies were everywhere abolished, and democracies established in the place. Aristagoras had brought all of Hellenic Asia Minor into revolt, but evidently realized that the Greeks would need other allies in order to successfully fight the Persians. In the winter of 499 BC, he first sailed to Sparta, the preeminent Greek state in matters of war. However, despite Aristagoras's entreaties, the Spartan king Cleomenes I turned down the offer to lead the Greeks against the Persians. Aristagoras therefore turned instead to Athens. Athens had recently become a democracy, overthrowing its own tyrant Hippias. In the fight to establish the democracy, the Athenians had asked the Persians for aid in return for submitting to Persian overlordship. Some years later, Hippias had attempted to regain power in Athens, assisted by the Spartans. This attempt failed and Hippias fled to Artaphernes, and tried to persuade him to subjugate Athens. The Athenians dispatched ambassadors to Artaphernes to dissuade him from taking action, but Artaphernes merely instructed the Athenians to take Hippias back as tyrant. Needless to say, the Athenians had balked at this, and resolved instead to be openly at war with Persia. Since they were already an enemy of Persia, Athens was already in a position to support the Ionian cities in the revolt. The fact that the Ionian democracies were inspired by the example of the Athenian democracy no doubt helped persuade the Athenians to support the Ionian Revolt, especially since the cities of Ionia were originally Athenian colonies. Aristagoras was also successful in persuading the city of Eretria to send assistance to the Ionians for reasons that are not completely clear. Possibly commercial reasons were a factor. Eretria was a mercantile city, whose trade was threatened by Persian dominance of the Aegean. Herodotus suggests that the Eretrians supported the revolt in order to repay the support the Milesians had given Eretria some time previously, possibly referring to the Lelantine War. Ionian offensive. Over the winter, Aristagoras continued to foment rebellion. In one incident, he told a group of Paeonians, who Darius had brought to live in Phrygia, to return to the homeland. Herodotus says that his only purpose in doing this was to vex the Persian high command. Sardis. In the spring of 498 BC, an Athenian force of 20 triremes, accompanied by 5 from Eretria, set sail for Ionia. They joined up with the main Ionian force near Ephesus. Declining to personally lead the force, Aristagoras appointed his brother Charipinus and another Milesian, Hermophantus, as generals. This force was then guided by the Ephesians through the mountains to Sardis, Artaphernes' satrapal capital. The Greeks caught the Persians unaware, and were able to capture the lower city. However, Artaphernes still held the citadel with a significant force of men. The lower city then caught on fire, Herodotus suggests accidentally, which quickly spread. The Persians in the citadel, being surrounded by a burning city, emerged into the marketplace of Sardis, where they fought with the Greeks, forcing them back. The Greeks, demoralized, then retreated from the city, and began to make the way back to Ephesus. Herodotus reports that when Darius heard of the burning of Sardis, he swore vengeance upon the Athenians, and tasked a servant with reminding him 3 times each day of his vow, "Master, remember the Athenians." Battle of Ephesus. Herodotus says that when the Persians in Asia Minor heard of the attack on Sardis, they gathered together, and marched to the relief of Artaphernes. When they arrived at Sardis, they found the Greeks recently departed. So they followed the tracks back towards Ephesus. They caught up with the Greeks outside Ephesus, and the Greeks were forced to turn and prepare to fight. Holland suggests that the Persians were primarily cavalry. The typical Persian cavalry of the time were probably missile cavalry, whose tactics were to wear down a static enemy with volley after volley. It is clear that the demoralized and tired Greeks were no match for the Persians, and were completely routed in the battle which ensued at Ephesus. Many were killed, including the Eretrian general Alcides. The Ionians who escaped the battle made for their own cities, while the remaining Athenians and Eretrians managed to return to the ships and sailed back to Greece. Spread of the revolt. The Athenians now ended their alliance with the Ionians, since the Persians had proved to be anything but the easy prey that Aristagoras had described. However, the Ionians remained committed to the rebellion, and the Persians did not seem to follow up the victory at Ephesus. Presumably these ad hoc forces were not equipped to lay siege to any of the cities. Despite the defeat at Ephesus, the revolt actually spread further. The Ionians sent men to the Hellespont and Propontis and captured Byzantium and the other nearby cities. They also persuaded the Carians to join the rebellion. Furthermore, seeing the spread of the rebellion, the kingdoms of Cyprus also revolted against Persian rule without any outside persuasion. Persian Counteroffensive. Herodotus's narrative after the Battle of Ephesus is ambiguous in its exact chronology. Historians generally place Sardis and Ephesus in 498 BC. Herodotus next describes the spread of the revolt, and says that the Cypriots had 1 year of freedom, therefore placing the action in Cyprus to 497 BC. He next says that Doris, Histiaeus, and Aristagoras, all of them Persian generals and married to daughters of Darius, pursued those Ionians who had marched to Sardis, and drove them to the ships. After this victory they divided the cities among themselves and sacked them. Quote, "This passage implies these Persian generals counter-attacked immediately after the Battle of Ephesus. However, the cities that Herodotus describes Doris as besieging were on the Hellespont, which did not become involved in the revolt until after Ephesus. It is therefore easiest to reconcile the account by assuming that Doris, Histiaeus, and Aristagoras waited until the next campaigning season before going on the counteroffensive. The Persian actions that Herodotus describes at the Hellespont and in Caria seem to be in the same year, and most commentators place them in 497 BC. Cyprus. In Cyprus, all the kingdoms had revolted except that of Amathus. The leader of the Cypriot revolt was Onesimus, brother of the king of Salamis in Cyprus, Gorgas. Gorgas did not want to revolt, so Onesimus locked his brother out of the city and made himself king. Gorgas went over to the Persians, and Onesimus persuaded the other Cypriots, apart from the Amathusians, to revolt. He then settled down to besiege Amathus. The following year, Onesimus heard that a Persian force under Artaphernes had been dispatched to Cyprus. Onesimus thus sent messengers to Ionia, asking them to send reinforcements, which they did in great force. A Persian army eventually arrived in Cyprus, supported by a Phoenician fleet. The Ionians opted to fight at sea and defeated the Phoenicians. In the simultaneous land battle, the Cypriots gained an initial advantage, killing Artaphernes. However, the defection of two contingents to the Persians crippled the cause. They were routed and Onesimus was killed. The revolt in Cyprus was thus crushed and the Ionians sailed home. Hellespont and Propontis. The Persian forces in Asia Minor seem to have been reorganized in 497 BC, with 3 of Darius's sons-in-law, Doris, Histiaeus, and Aristagoras, taking charge of 3 armies. Herodotus suggests that these generals divided up the rebellious lands between themselves and then set out to attack the respective areas. Doris, who seems to have had the largest army, initially took his army to the Hellespont. There, he systematically besieged and took the cities of Dardanus, Abydos, Perkit, Lampsacus and Pedssis, each in a single day according to Herodotus. However, when he heard that the Carians were revolting, he moved his army southwards to attempt to crush this new rebellion. This places the timing of the Carian revolt to early 497 BC. Histiaeus went to the Propontis and took the city of Ceos. After Doris moves his forces towards Caria, Histiaeus marched towards the Hellespont and captured many of the Aeolian cities as well as some of the cities in the Troad. However, he then fell ill and died, ending his campaign. Meanwhile, Aristagoras, together with Artaphernes, campaigned in Ionia. Caria. Battle of the Marsias. Hearing that the Carians had rebelled, Doris led his army south into Caria. the Carians gathered at the White Pillars on the Mysias River, a tributary of the meander. Doris, a relative of the king of Cilicia, suggested that the Carians should cross the river and fight with it at the backs, so as to prevent retreat and thus make them fight more bravely. This idea was rejected and the Carians made the Persians cross the river to fight them. The ensuing battle was, according to Herodotus, a long affair, with the Carians fighting obstinately before eventually succumbing to the weight of Persian numbers. Herodotus suggests that 10,000 Carians and 2,000 Persians died in the battle. Battle of Labranda. The survivors of Mysias fell back to a sacred grove of Zeus at Labranda and deliberated whether to surrender to the Persians or to flee Asia altogether. However, while deliberating, they were joined by a Milesian army, and with these reinforcements resolved instead to carry on fighting. The Persians then attacked the army at Labranda, and inflicted an even heavier defeat, with the Milesians suffering particularly bad casualties. Battle of Pedssis. After the double victory over the Carians, Doris began the task of reducing the Carian strongholds. The Carians resolved to fight on, and decided to lay an ambush for Doris on the road through Pedssis. Herodotus implies that this occurred more or less directly after Labranda, but it has also been suggested that Pedssis occurred the following year, giving the Carians time to regroup. The Persians arrived at Pedssis during the night, and the ambush was sprung to great effect. The Persian army was annihilated and Doris and the other Persian commanders were slain. The disaster at Pedssis seems to have created a stalemate in the land campaign, and there was apparently little further campaigning in 496 BC. In 495 BC, Ionia, the Third Persian army, under the command of Artaphernes and Artaphernes, attacked Ionia and Aeolia. They retook Clazomenae and Syme, probably in 497 BC, but then seem to have been less active in 496 BC. In 495 BC, probably as a result of the calamity in Caria. At the height of the Persian counteroffensive, Aristagoras, sensing the untenability of his position, decided to abandon his responsibilities as leader of Miletus and of the revolt. He left Miletus with all the members of his faction who would accompany him, and went to the part of Thrace that Darius had granted to Histiaeus after the campaign of 513 BC. Herodotus, who evidently has a rather negative view of him, suggests that Aristagoras simply lost his nerve and fled. Some modern historians have suggested that he went to Thrace to exploit the greater natural resources of the region, and thus support the revolt. Others have suggested that finding himself at the center of an internal conflict in Miletus, he chose to go into exile rather than exacerbate the situation. In Thrace, he took control of the city that Histiaeus had founded, Merchanus, and started campaigning against the local Thracian population. However, during one campaign, probably in either 497 BC or 496 BC, he was killed by the Thracians. Aristagoras was the one man who might have been able to provide the revolt with a sense of purpose. But after his death the revolt was left effectively leaderless. Shortly after this, Histiaeus was released from his duties in Susa by Darius and sent to Ionia. He had persuaded Darius to let him travel to Ionia by promising to make the Ionians end the revolt. However, Herodotus leaves us in no doubt that his real aim was simply to escape his quasi-captivity in Persia. When he arrived in Sardis, Artaphernes directly accused him of fomenting the rebellion with Aristagoras. "I will tell you, Histiaeus, the truth of this business. It was you who stitched this shoe, and Aristagoras who put it on." Histiaeus fled that night to Chios and eventually made his way back to Miletus. However, having just got rid of one tyrant, the Milesians were in no mood to receive Histiaeus back. He therefore went to Mytilene in Lesbos and persuaded the Lesbians to give him 8 triremes. He set sail for Byzantium with all those who would follow him. There he established himself, seizing all ships that attempted to sail through the Bosphorus, unless they agreed to serve him.